Hi, good evening. I'm Lonnie Stonich, the Executive Director of FAN, and I'm honored to welcome you tonight to a conversation between Joseph Earl Thomas and Kathy Lynn Che. Thanks for joining us. FAN is celebrating its 40th anniversary this year, and we're honored to have the robust support of dozens of schools, nonprofits, corporations, families, and individuals from across the country. We're committed to our vision of an informed and compassionate community, and will achieve that vision by presenting fresh ideas that elevate minds, expand hearts, and make the world a better place. We have hundreds of videos of past events archived on our YouTube channel, so be sure to subscribe to get updates when new recordings are posted. And now for some introductions. Joseph Earl Thomas is a writer from Frankfort, Pennsylvania, whose work has appeared or is forthcoming in VQR, N+1, Gulf Coast, The Offing, and the Kenyon Review. He has an MFA in prose from the University of Notre Dame and is a doctoral candidate in English from the University of Pennsylvania. An excerpt of his new memoir, Sink, won the 2020 Chautauqua Janus Prize, and he has received fellowships from Fulbright, Vona, or VONA, I'm not sure, he'll tell us, Tin House, and Breadloaf. Kathy Lynn Che is the author of Split, winner of the Kundeman Poetry Prize, the Norma Farber First Book Award from the Poetry Society of America, and the Best Poetry Book Award from the Association of Asian American Studies. She is also the co-author with Kyle Lucia Wu of the children's book An Asian American A to Z, a children's guide to our history, which will be published in Haymarket Books in May of 2023, just a couple months away. She is working on a poetry manuscript, a creative nonfiction manuscript, and a short documentary on her parents' experience as refugees who played extras on Apocalypse Now. She works as executive director at Kundeman, a national nonprofit that nurtures Asian American voices. And now let's welcome Joseph Earl Thomas and Kathy Lynn Che to FAN.
Yeah, and thank you, Kathy, for being here,
Yeah.
well, for agreeing to do this.
Yeah, for sure. And thank you, Joseph, for joining. Happy Pub Week.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, FAN, for having us. You've been doing incredible work for 40 years, and we're just so honored to be hosted by them today. Sink debuted this week. It's your debut memoir, your debut book, and it came out on Tuesday to a rave review from Brian Washington in the New York Times. So for those who don't know much about this book yet, I'll read a description of Sink from the review, and then we'll get started. Set in Philadelphia, largely in the late 1990s, Sink chronicles Thomas's journey as a Black kid growing up in the city toward awareness and softness and confidence and discernibility. We meet his family, including his grandfather and mother, individuals both harmful and harmed by the world. We meet his friends who oscillate between serving as lifelines and threats. We see how he uses geek culture or nerd culture with its interconnected worlds and minutiae, attendant concerns and standards and solaces as both a refuge and a compass. So, Joseph, would you just kick off the event by reading a portion of your book?
Yeah, of course. And thank you for that description. So the section that Kathy suggested I read is from about midway through the book. It needs only a little bit of explanation by way of saying that the book has a bunch of different animals in it, there's like a circulation of pets that I, the protagonist, my child self, Joey, kind of cycles through and like tries to raise and mostly fails at taking care of. And this is kind of one such pet in that pantheon. $100 ain't even that much for a whole alligator, Joey thought, walking up Frankfort Avenue, clutching rusted bills in one hand, feeling the other crumpled up ducat secure in his left sock. Always keep your money in two separate places, Pop-Pop liked to say, and Joey remembered. He'd forgotten, though, that Philadelphia is a city of great seasons, that he himself had caught cold, then pneumonia, and nearly died at someone's children's hospital, no thanks to his own body's shallow attempts at thermoregulation. He was forgetting weakness in favor of developing strength. The alligator was a part of that. And it was warm out now, the perfect temperature for an alligator. It was getting warmer all the time. And nothing lasts forever anyway, Joey thought. Best to get an alligator now before it was too late and put everything off until later, if later ever came. The balding Chinese man at Birds was too excited about selling an alligator to Joey to inform him about care. He'd seen enough Animal Planet to know what alligators did anyway. Most of Joey and the man's chats had centered on Joey's questions, which always had to do with how big the various animals got and whether he could cuddle them or not. And even if the man had said anything in caution, it's likely that Joey would have simply ignored him, knowing far better than to trust an adult. Nothing but lies and trickery, self-exceptions, excuses for why he should show them deference, but they never needed to show him respect, and so on. Either way, Joey had saved up $99.99 from cutting grass and shoveling snow with a patience he would run out of long before his own adulthood. This was long after he'd spent the money from hustling baby garter snakes on cheesesteaks and blue sodas, double cheeseburgers, and stockpiles of freeze-dried shrimp-flavored noodles in styrofoam cups. He spent his $20 allowance mostly on food, too. Before that, sure, he dabbled in geckos or newts for a while, considered a savanna monitor, a black and white tegu twice, and even had an iguana named Lizzie in between. But an alligator, to have and to hold, would be the kind of real and otherworldly satisfaction that Joey had longed for through all of the dead animal bodies. Its name would be Rex. This sounded more prehistoric, like the way Rex looked. Eyes like amber with a slit down the center, Rex's teeth and jaws and skin and claws rugged like those car tires sitting in that lot across the street. It was clear to Joey that Rex was not the type to desiccate easily. Desiccate being yet another one of Joey's favorite words, ever since Icewind Dale, when your party discovers the remains of a massive sea dragon, quote, desiccated atop a great snowy mountain. Joey pondered what this said about geological time and naively gathered the courage once to ask this question during a block of grade school science instruction. Nevertheless, Joey dug a hole in the forbidden backyard right above where he'd buried Quayle. Poor Quayle. There were no bones, no trace of the old dead bird. Its skeleton, so brittle, had become one again with that planet beneath the tread of Joey's filas, those sneakers that Tia called faggots in L.A., Joey wanted to honor Quayle's memory, but it was like Quayle had never existed. He couldn't even remember the strange noises it made, only that they were strange. And alligators need ponds, maybe even a moat, actually, something like Guts and Griffith had built to protect the Band of the Hawk. Berserk needed only suggest dealing with a devil for paradise to muddy up the boy's moral superiority. And Griffith knew, that skinny little flamboyant boy who made it, who fucked and made friends, who conquered and protected, who made himself unforgivable in the end, that we must abolish the dead to make space for the living. It was from this kind of forward thinking that the boy's pride would emerge. Joey measured and dug the pond over Quayle's grave to be 3 feet deep by however wide his imagination might carry it. The dig alone took more than a whole day, but Joey woke up early and rushed through it. There were scarcely any kids outside, and the sun waned as Joey walked home with a whole alligator in tow. Rex's scaly body rested the length of his forearm, with a rubber band tied twice around his snout like a muzzle. Joey felt bad about this and reassured Rex that they would be home soon and he'd remove it. Rex was about the size that Lizzie the iguana was when she died, and just as inactive, but with a meatier tail. Joey put Rex down in the dry pond and loosened the band from his mouth. The creature just stared at him, blinking slowly. Then Joey turned on the garden hose and filled the pond with water. Unlike Blackie, who tore up everything and barked and disturbed the neighbors, Blackie the dog, Rex didn't budge. The boy could sense neither joy nor trepidation from his new friend. So he sprayed Rex with a hose a little, trying to get a rise out of him. The water splashed off Rex's snout and eyes, but he remained calm. The most he would give Joey was turning around to be sprayed in the back instead. Then, once the pond was adequately transformed into mud, Rex just walked away from it. Joey sprang into action, grabbing Rex by his soft belly, placing him back in the pond where he'd be safe. The myriad encounters where baby gators were eaten by birds or snakes on Animal Planet flashed before his eyes and made his heart pump faster. Sweat dripped down his face. "Stay," Joey said. And Rex did. In that moment, Joey had even begun losing faith in Steve Irwin, who seemed always to struggle with alligators, all mounting and tackling and yelling. Rex was calm. And then, gazing down at his creation, Joey saw that it was good. Thanks, Kathy.
That was very great. Thank you so much. I'm gonna launch into some questions a little out of order, but
Yeah.
sorry for my preparation, giving you preparation and then not and then messing it up. But so I'm very curious about, well, actually, I pointed out this passage because I thought it'd be nice to have you be able to read out a place that was a little, I find myself, it's really funny and it's really joyful. This scene in particular, we
Okay.
know
Yeah.
what, yeah. But the book isn't necessarily all in that register, certainly not. So something I wanted to ask about was the use of the third person, because so much of the book really talks about, the memoir. We usually expect it to be, I did this, I did that. And so just about the third person, a lot of people have talked about it, but it might be nice to hear from you some of the ways that you were thinking about what the third person, talking about Joey, the child, offered you in this memoir.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's still good to hear and think about. I mean, there's a bunch of different reasons that was a concern or a set of questions I had. I mean, one of them, right, is like there's a certain kind of validity or there's a fairly concretized set of expectations to like a first person explanation of experience, particularly from folks that are dealing with certain kinds of subjection or violence, et cetera, right? And I think that there's for me not very much reason why you couldn't use a third person, right? Sometimes ostensibly I think part of the expectation is that speaking from the first person in a register to or about violence to a particular set of power structures should have, in this sense, an ability to like overturn them or make those needs known. But I don't think I'm saying anything new in that register, right? I think plenty smarter people than me, particularly who write history, sociology, etc., have said much, more intelligible or valuable things in the register of thinking about like, the thing that we might call Black trauma or certain kinds of like violent experiences. Instead, I really wanted to move in a register or to kind of try and live in a register that was really about thinking from a child's perspective. That could be expanded to thinking about, Black children more broadly, if as much as it could, but one that was like not necessarily full of the kind of knowing and introspection and the uses of language that we have become kind of so familiar with now. And part of the problem was that when I was writing in first person is that I would do a lot of explaining. And so, I mean, one of the things about the book that was important for me is there's not a lot of there's a lot of narrative and there's a lot of questioning and there's a lot of inquiry, but there's not a lot of explaining. And I didn't really want to be more essayistic in that kind of explanatory mode. And I was really interested in, as a primary audience, in speaking to people that I know and love, a lot of whom appear in the book. And who, I wanted to keep in conversation with what was happening. And I felt like, there are, very different, this has to do with like language too, right? I was trying to capture the way that people talk, the way that I was perceiving the shifts in the usages of certain words, especially concerning violence, right? Like how we talked about things, not necessarily how I learned through like a college education and a particular set of norming institutions to discuss these things. And it felt like to me a good way to kind of keep that attention to other people, attention to the self and the body, as not fully actualized and not kind of factually understood. And, and this is the way that as a child, I thought about things. Using the third person for me was very valuable for that. And it pushed away from this kind of like, I'm the incessant, like, I'm going to tell you everything about this experience that I think sometimes is an expectation of writing memoir.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, because I think a lot of times people think of the I as very authorial, meaning like I am authoring my life. And there's a way that the third person might be able to offer even a sense of its like it's a storytelling frame that allows for an adult self to be telling the story of a younger self. So there's both distance and the ability to be more intimate and even fabricate not in a lying way, but to sort of reconstruct memory in a certain way and to dive in and out of interiority in a way that feels purposeful. So I really appreciate that
It's related.
answer as well.
I mean, you had brought up that Michelle T. memoir, Black Wave, that is all in third person, that I read before, mostly like for the sake of humor. And I do think that in complicated situations, sometimes that context, I think we're so used to reading, novels in the third person, right, too. And sometimes for humor, that can be, it's a different kind of humor that one can have, like situational versus like introspective, or like the kind of like knowing in on the joke kind of humor that I think sometimes works better in third person versus first person.
Yeah, I think in that memoir, Michelle T's Black Wave, she kind of really makes herself into an unlikable character that she like lances and makes fun of. So I think like it's, like your memoir is only the second memoir I've seen in the third person, and it's operating in my mind very differently, but it is kind of an interesting way to approach, what people think of conventionally as memoir. Okay, so as a follow-up, I'm thinking a lot about register in the book because the main character, Joey, has this thinking and vocabulary that is natural to a child, but also has thinking and vocabulary available to somebody older, an adult self looking back at a young self, and just thinking about how that's managed and modulated, because it's not exactly, the vocabulary is not just at eye level from a 7-year-old, 8-year-old brain necessarily only, although kids are very smart, obviously, but there's a lot of awareness that can come. It's sort of a blend of the two. So there's this example that I am thinking about in the book, and the book has a lot of different types of sexual content, but it begins with a word that is really interesting. It's always deployed as winky, right? And then there's a turn where it becomes, dick. And it's very purposeful. It's described really openly and honestly in the book as this kind of verbal coming of age into, from boyhood into kind of like a manhood that, Joey doesn't really know if that's a world he wants to like grow up into, but it is there, right? So, So another possibility I think about register is the ways that, you, Joseph Earl Thomas, you're currently a PhD student at this Ivy League school, one of the top English literature programs in the nation, and in the same city where you grew up alongside folks who didn't necessarily graduate from college, whose English is born of Frankfurt. So maybe coming from a specific type of English, Philadelphia, Black, neighborhood speak of the 1990s. So how do you think maybe using either the third person or different verbal registers opens up these possibilities for different types of language to coexist and work together?
Yeah. That's really helpful to think about. So, that was really deliberate. It's something that I thought about a lot, right? Even like it's interesting, like as a writer, one of the first things is like when you write about text, you have to choose the words. And sometimes we don't even, we can hardly get past choosing what fucking words to use to talk.
That's so real.
Right? Yeah, sometimes like that's a problem, in talking to writers in general, like no matter what kind of content it is, whether it involves like anyone's genitalia ever in any circumstance. And, that's coupled with, right, of course, this other thing where I'm talking about a situation where there's like kids that are being forced to grow up like fast, right? As one often is. And then also this other weird thing where like people try to often treat you like a child in certain contexts, right? When it comes to like your own agency or certain kinds of freedom, but then expect you to be an adult in when it's convenient for them, right? So it's like very confusing sometimes for a kid. And a lot of times that has to do with like language, right? So there's a kind of, my grandfather and most of the people in my family as well, right? When we were younger, the word winky was deployed as the term for like a little boy, like a prepubescent boy's penis, or as like a kind of insult to a post-pubescent boy's penis when one was not like virile or like manly enough, right? Like that was the description in that case. But, there was all these other times where I would see like my grandfather or like uncles or like older boys or whatever, or like older women referring to using the word dick all the time. And it wasn't even always clear to me as a child that that was the case. And sometimes these are moments of like sexual intensity that I was witnessing from adults who had 10 moments ago said like, okay, you're a child. But then I'm like
Mm,
witnessing this other thing that is like quite obviously not child like content. And,
mm,
for me, that's the like trying to impart like whatever possibilities there are for learning, because a big part of the book is about kind of the failure of traditional like education, right? I mean, there's a lot of conversations about the Philadelphia school district, and its difficulties kind of constantly. And that was like very clear in my own early life, right? Whereby like I didn't feel like I was learning anything at school. I also didn't feel like I was safe at school. So even if I were more motivated or dedicated, there just was, there was a lot of things going on, right? And so the way that I was learning words also and paying attention to words, like I had an intellectual curiosity, but the only way that it was being met was this kind of goofy scenario between like noticing when people were using certain words and other words for like the genitalia. And the other thing is that like there's a series of words like the kind of desiccate or whatever, like a word that you would see more of an
mm,
adult person using, or in a different context from video games, right? Because there's this
mm,
strange way that a lot of these kind of RPG games that I was playing, where they're not voiced and you have to read everything,
mm,
you can't progress in the story unless you kind of understand what's going on, right? You can't get pleasure from
mm,
it. And since those were such, there was a kind of so high on my list of like desires or things of doing,
mm,
I would be playing these games that were made for like adults or whatever, but I would just be sitting there figuring it out, right? So a lot of these kinds of tabletop games, there's a lot of shit happening in like Icewind Dale that I was playing when I was like, I don't know, 10 or something, right? There's all kinds of violence, there's all kinds
yeah.
of language, good and bad. And I was using some of that, like I was thinking about some of that language and being like, okay, how does this relate to what I'm actually hearing in real life in these spaces, right? Because, public school just really wasn't doing it for me or most of the people
Hmm.
that were around me.
Yeah, another kind of thing that stood out in the passage that you read is like the acronym for FILA that Tia in the book was saying out loud. And there's a kind of way where language, I think, in there is, it's really, for me at least, it's really tempting oftentimes to scrub out or sanitize the language that's around us, the racism of one's family members, the sexism, the misogyny, the homophobia, whatever it is in our environment. These are people who are complicated people, but there is a desire oftentimes to sort of like, well, I want to tell a real story about real people, but I want them to be sympathetic, so I'm going to
Mhm.
scrub those pieces out. So how did you make the decision to not do that in your, because you don't want to necessarily betray your community
Yeah.
who has had so much happen to them already? So how do you like not fall into this sort of kind of very real desire to like erase things in order to sort of sanitize, prop them up, whatever it is?
Yeah, yeah, that's such a real desire too, especially, when if you're the only person whose like class background is shifting, so, whose class is like shifting so kind of rapidly and back and forth and all that, right? I think it's true that like my first and primary loyalties are to kind of friends and family who like knew and loved me, however
Mm,
complicatedly, before I knew whatever other words I could substitute for whatever things that have become fucked up. And part of that, for me, it's like yes, there's always a temptation to make everyone sound like, I don't know, like a liberal robot or something, right? Like right, like to be like to prove that each and every character like knows all of the right words to use, um, and that they deploy them when appropriate. But I don't know. I think that there's a level of dishonesty that I just find insufferable in doing
mm,
that, in something that where I'm trying to approach realism as best I can. And, I think that it kind of obscures rather than like corrects certain kinds of violence,
mm,
you know. I feel the same way. I mean, I feel this way when it comes to even writing descriptions of actual violence happening, or
mm,
and similarly to like the words that people use, right? It's like, sure, I could, in a way of one, trying to protect the reader, and two, protect people involved. I could do something that kind of makes it less obvious as to what's happening. But then I thought about it, and I actually, through a set of like literary techniques and, allusions and metaphors that people use to talk about violence. And, that's a way to go about things. But I'm really frustrated by those kinds of texts or when that
Mm,
happens. Um, and I don't want to do that. Like, if there is something that's fucked up that is happening, and this is also true with like life,
mm,
right? I think that we've gotten really good at developing ways to kind of talk around it without being forced to feel a way that would suggest we make adjustments to what we are doing, thinking,
mhm,
feeling in
mhm,
those moments. And I felt like I would be letting myself and kind of everyone else, everyone involved, and the reader off the hook. I mean, I'm also not like, even though I'm a child, I'm not like a nice person in the book, right?
mhm,
I don't, or at least I hope not, right? If I am, then that's kind of a failing, right? I'm not creating a situation where I look better than a bunch of other folks. So that was
mhm,
really important to me, and I felt like it's difficult to describe, but I think that that's part of it. My own encounters with like reading that obscures violence, even though it's factually still happening, frustrate me more than trying to slow down and derive serious accounts of
mhm.
how we participate in these kinds of meaning making and doing and harms, etc.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. I love the word. I mean, I love what you're talking about when you're talking about realism and what that means in light of all the ways that we not only talk around but create fictions around, what it means to be, healthy, healing, uh good, what one should want, one should desire or desire to attain. And
Yeah.
I think there is something really powerful about the subjectivity of this person and the way that it's told, in that it's trying not to lie. I think that's like kind of something that I really love about this book, is that, the alligator scene, it doesn't really show like the scope of everything that happens to Joey, but it does have moments where you have discussions about, masculinity and, like what it means to be normal, or what it means to like want or care about something. So I'm very moved by all of that. And I think I wanted to talk a little bit about the idea of honesty. And,
Mhm.
there's a way that in memoir, the publishing industry really wants to believe that, the only way you could possibly have a book published at a big five, big four publisher is to,
Mhm.
be a celebrity, to have lived an
Right.
extraordinary
Right.
life, or have something packaged into a set of like very easily digestible lessons that can be passed along. And, I was just thinking about, one of your favorite memoirs is Audre Lorde Zami. And the scene that really stays with me is she's in the kitchen and she's pounding something and with a mortar and pestle. It's like this very tactile, sensual scene, but it's not very sensational. It's not very extraordinary. But, on the other hand, this idea of like what is sensational really does sell. So how do you work through your thinking about, like your fidelity to this realism and this like faith that, your memoir will have something to offer that that is truthful rather than something that could be saleable.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean that's super difficult. I think that like Zami, I mean that memoir does a great job at thinking about the ordinary or thinking through the ordinary, because there's a lot of scenes like that, right? Where things slow down, and there's a lot of conflict too, right? And it's not always like out and out conflict, and sometimes it's like conflict with folks who you're like not supposed to have conflict with,
Mm,
etc. Right? And I think there's like another thing I think about that, like there's a lot of risk in that memoir. I mean, it's something
mm,
that there's a lot of those things that I admire. And, I feel like there is a certain kind of course, right. The easiest way to write this would be like, started from the bottom, now we're here kind of shit, where it's like, oh, look, I am perfect victim. Look at these things that happened to me. And now I am in college, right? Like, But like honestly, like first of all, my friends will whoop my ass. Like I would never be able. Like Aisha and Tasia and all them would be like, "What are you? What is wrong? Why would you do that?" Like Drake and all them. So I would never be able to actually do that and maintain the relationships that I have with people that I care deeply about, who like actually sustain me. Right? They'd be like, "This is ridiculous." And part of the reason that's ridiculous is that, I mean, that's one of the ways that you can like really, really exceptionalize yourself. And we want that. We kind of love that. Right. One of the things that I was thinking about being clear that I was not doing was like, I'm not writing like a hero narrative. Right. I'm like, it's not, I mean, coming of age narratives tend to, I think, sometimes fall into that trap or like set of expectations, right? Where like there's a big thing that gets overcome. There's a certain set of tropes that you can align with them, right? Difficult circumstances. There's like, usually a person, sometimes a teacher, a social worker, assisting with that circumstance, a lot of gumption, person like rises and overcomes, and then like turns out to subscribe to all of the norms later that one was probably fighting against. I mean, this is not universal, but these are some of the kind of tropes that happen. And for me, like the kind of intellectual part of it, and which is related to like the way I tend to feel right now about like reality or like norms and shit like that, is kind of like, oh, when I was a child, I was much better at challenging things that I thought were dumb, or being openly confused about them, asking the questions, right? Whether that was about a set of systems or gestures or whatever, and not anti-queerness or masculinity or sort of kind of what we would call like toxic masculinity now or whatever, even though you didn't have names for those things, there were ways that like as a child it's kind of obvious to a lot of children, like, oh, this is kind of fucked up, like why don't we, and then what happens, it just gets beaten out of you, right? Like over and over again, the challenging to particular positions gets beaten out of you. And I think that has a lot to do with how I decide what to say, not to say, and how, right? And this is like I was telling this story before. A good example is like my own kids, because something will happen, they'll discover something, right? Or like my son was like, "Oh my God, groceries are this expensive? Like, why would groceries be this? How do people afford to eat? Like this doesn't make any sense. Like, is this why you have to work so much, et cetera, on and on." And he's like, not just kind of, oh, like this is bad. He's like furious and super confused about a thing that is kind of taken for granted. I'm like, well, everybody can't fucking afford to eat, and that is not an accident. That is purposeful, right? And so it's things like that, and I felt like there was a way that there's always a risk of trying to subscribe to those things. So I guess what I ended up doing or trying to do in the 50th version of this thing was doing my best to kind of curtail some of those things along the way, while still providing a sense of rather than kind of constant growth, right? Capital G growth is more like the set of questions was changing. And the suggestion that this would continue happening rather than a kind of guaranteed, like stable, adult future where I work at, like, I don't know, like a law firm or, as a physician or something like that. Something that would be the most tolerable to like a kind of liberal audience.
Yeah, I think that that's something that I feel like people want. I don't know if it's particularly American. I have no idea, but I have been scouring the internet. It's probably an unhelpful thing to look at Goodreads reviews or things like that, but I think that it does frustrate me, and it makes me very furious, because I've been reading across, it's not just your memoir, but any memoir that does not provide comfort that this person's going to be okay. Typically, it's some sort of person who's talking about some sort of extreme violence, like, and they're just like, this is just too brutal. I need to know that this person's going to be okay. But I'm like, we're not okay. And I'm like, why do you want, like, what do you think this world is? I don't know. But there's a frustration that happens for me. And I'm extremely, like, just like I'm extremely mad about groceries and rent, I'm like also mad. And I think that there's a way where people don't want to be mad, like, because, the world is brutal. And so what do you do with that? Right. So I guess, like, what's your sense of things now that your book is in the world, and there is a set of desires and expectations from folks out there for redemption, comfort, something on the other end that can make it, but you do have joy, humor, other thing, connection, those things are present, but the implication of the book is not that this person's gonna definitely 100% be okay in the end, right?
Yeah. I mean, that's, it's so funny. I guess I'm the kind of person, I tend to assume like that is going to be one of the ways that people will read the book. And I'm kind of like, well, I'm just going to have to deal with that, my own kind of experience in reading. I think that this has helped to some degree. So my own experience of reading is mostly like as an adult, right? Like I didn't read as a child. I didn't read growing up. It just wasn't a thing that I did, except for like, video game text and stuff like that, back and forth. So, I wasn't already comfortable with a set of norms that I would have developed during the crucial moments of my life, right? So it's not like I was reading all these things and being like, oh, this is, and like just kind of unconsciously starting to embody all of these ideas about what a book could do, what a book should do, etc., which also like really put me at odds with in a lot, during the MFA sometimes and stuff like that, really put me at odds with like what people were trying to do or who they were trying to replicate and things like that. I was like, but why? What is the reason? Oh, lineage, history, I'm like, what? Yeah, but like, why? Let's think about like more specifically, what is the function of the specific way that you're crafting the sentences and what are they supposed to do? And so I guess I kind of got comfortable with the idea that, I wasn't going to be, satisfactory to everyone. And I think that if you're someone who's like kind of skeptical or I'm not even skeptical, just really kind of angry at everyday reality stuff, like the way the fucking judicial system works, especially in regards to like all of my friends and family, like the things about rent, food, etc., in ways that you just, you attempt to making alternate family structures and stuff, and you always have to fight with people all the time, even like well-meaning like leftist people who are like, oh, just leave it and just do the thing, and I'm like, I fucking don't want to. I think it's you get kind of used to the idea, you get really used to the idea that like we're just not gonna agree. But I think that conflict in those ways is like really good. And maybe this is the thing about the descriptions of violence too. It's related to this, is that hiding the things that we are in constant conflict about is like not useful. And you get accustomed to, I mean, like even the people that I love the most, we have plenty of conflicts about things, sometimes having to do with our own histories, identity, circumstance, whatever. But like, I think what works is that no one's trying to pretend that is not the case, and just aligning it rather than trying to think and feel through those things, which I think is super important. And so for me, I guess I just developed a comfort to some degree, right? It can still be really frustrating, a comfort to some degree with the idea that, everybody's not going to be with it. And I lucked out in a lot of ways because I did meet people along the way, right? Like you being one of them, Elias, who did the event before as well. There's lots of friends, right? Kiasi, who blurred the book, and like Brian Washington, who wrote this review, who I didn't know, but like very lucky that I feel like he did an amazing reading of the text. Who I was like, okay, like I'm not completely, I don't feel completely alone in that, even when I feel frustrated in the kind of everyday.
That makes a lot of sense. It's good to hear because, I like being liked, I like being loved.
We all do.
I know, but I want everybody to love what I have to say. I don't want to hear, I don't want to hear somebody who doesn't get it, that doesn't comfort me. But, so it's nice to hear. I was at another Zoom thing and somebody was saying, if you're writing something challenging to some folks, then, they're going to be challenged. So I really liked hearing that.
That's a good way to think about it, right? Like if you were trying to, and I think that that's one of the things that literature can do, right? And there's like a certain kind of way that people don't always think of memoir as like literature, but that's a whole separate kind of thing. But I do think, like one of the things that literature can do is pose challenges to a set of kind of structured norms that can be a problem, even if, a lot of us who are, who we might think of as like morally good even, think that those things are fine, right? And we should be trying to do that over and over again, because this is one of the ways that we can actually do it.
Yeah, and grow.
Yeah.
do something, change,
Yeah.
think. I guess I have a question also about, because I am, the thing about, I was curious about memoir because there are expectations, whereas like in poetry, you can be real sad, you can write endlessly sad, my friend told me a typical Kathy poem is like, it's sad, then it gets sadder, right? Like, so that's a convention that's like totally acceptable, but a convention that is not as expected is humor. You don't have to be joyful, you don't have to be funny, you don't have to be happy, but this memoir does have those moments, and I was just curious about, how do you do it? Like, is that natural to you? For me, the sad poem is natural, pain, trauma, all of that stuff, very natural. Being kind of funny, I'm a funny person in real life, but like on the page, it's a little bit more challenging. So I was just curious about that for you, as well as just sort of like when you talk about realism, the truth is, as dire as everything is, that's a part of our lives too. No matter how sad or, like people just want, there's a way that, I write a lot about sexual violence or whatever, and people really want to like focus on locking you into that space too, which is a trap as well. So yeah, I just wanted to hear what you were thinking about and what that experience was like.
Yeah. I mean, I think, this is like relation to the honesty thing too. I think that in my life, the folks who raised me, who I lived with, who I grew up with, were like way more honest than a lot of people who I meet in like my kind of intellectual life generally. And I think like usually much funnier too. And so, I mean, and I think also your more recent work, I think is like very funny actually.
Yeah. But not poetry.
Right. Yeah. Different thing. And, I think that it does it feels unnatural if, you're not kind of dealing with the comic at all, right? Because the registers work better when you are thinking through, sometimes even in the same sentence, something like really, really fucked up and something that is like actually kind of hilarious, right? Right adjacent to that could happen in the same moment in your life, right? At the same time, next day, next moment, and it's especially what some of my favorite moments are like when something is really fucked up, but somebody else, like your friend or something, does something really funny and you want to kind of laugh, but you also want to be angry because of the thing that you're like affronted by whatever kind of violence you just dealt with, but your friend or whatever is being really funny or really cute or something like that. Those are some of my favorite moments because those are like moments of just like high emotional intensity in general.
Yeah.
And I think that they work in concert with each other, and they kind of, you need all those pieces. If I were to write something ever without any humor at all, I mean, I don't know how I would be true to anyone I actually know, or any experience, I ever had. And so it feels just as natural as having, as trying to elongate or prolong kind of scenes of violence where thinking and feeling are happening through them.
Yeah, I really like, you have a lot of descriptions of your younger self through how people describe you as like really noodle-like or whatever it is. And it's like both painful to read because, it's a little sad to be constantly made fun of, but it is like extremely humorous, so I feel like
it's also like, a lot of people that I,
it's creative,
know. I mean, like talking shit as a kind of love language for so many Black folks that I know, right? Like it's very funny. Like my kids are getting better at like talking trash. So now my daughter has been doing it. So every time I say like, you say, oh, like I want this thing or this thing is nice. I'm like, oh, you look like that thing or whatever. And they like have started to kind of learn a lingo, like the language of like making jokes and shit. And they're getting a lot of better. So that has been a lot of fun. And it kind of reminds me like, oh, this is part of the thing that comes natural to a lot of people that I know or spend time with,
Yeah, I mean, I guess okay, so I have this I wanted to cap off, this portion with the end of that New York Times review. I was very struck by it because it was a very sensitive read. And that's kind of like one of the biggest gifts that you can ever have because you're just sort of like grinding on this thing for 10 years, 12 years. I don't know how long it takes, but you don't know how it's going to ever be received. And I think part of the fear sometimes when you write from a certain place is that, first of all, you'll never be believed, and then secondly, people aren't going to understand what you're trying to do, because it just takes so much to try to sort of get a sort of subtle, sensitive thing across. But I was very moved by this. And so I'm going to read the end of it because it's something I'm still turning over my head. And I would just like to hear what you think of it. So Brian Washington writes, because Sink is among so many other things also a book about care. The care where I'm a crier, so it's just the care we're taught to accept, the care we learn from others, the care we seek, and the care we find, the care we envision, molding and remolding its contours into something that is a comfortable fit for us. But perhaps one of the biggest boons of Sink is its insistence that care is above all shared. It is everyone's prerogative. So how did you read that ending? Like, does that chime off with you in terms of your intentions or feelings about what the book is talking about or offering?
Yeah, I mean, so this is something that I was thinking about through, throughout writing the book. And it starts with the kind of thing, it's like, somebody reminded me at a talk the other day, I was like, I remember a time where you stopped talking to a bunch of people, including like my grandfather. There was like years where we didn't speak at all, right? Which was like, not true of the past, like, 10 or so years, but he just died like maybe 3 weeks ago. And that was like very sad, but we had become closer in my kind of adult life. And one of the things aside from like him actually being like, yes, this is what I did, thought, felt, just being generally honest about things. And one of the things that's true is like, when people do things, if you are taking them at their best, people are doing things that they think are good and useful, particularly people in fucked up situations, right? People are doing things that they think are absolutely necessary. So like me getting my ass beat is actually not for someone else's pleasure. It's just because my grandfather thought that was a thing that would help. Old angry dude spent good deal of his time in gangs in prison, comes back, has to raise all these kids and kind of some adults to some degree who are not his, and it's just like, this kid is too soft. If I am hard enough to him, he will be hard enough to like do something on his own, either help me in this house with what the fuck is going on here, or like be hard enough to kind of survive the world in a lot of ways, right? And that's not, that's not like a new thing, right? That's not like something that people don't know, but it is something that I think about whenever anyone does anything, right? It's like people really do think that what they're doing is in particular, not just for people that are not just acceptable, but is like also necessary, or the thing that is most valuable for someone else, right? Even if you experience that thing as harmful. And I think, and I think about like the way that we always want to pretend that this is just not true for us. Like we always want to read something of something wrong happening and be like, I know that is morally wrong and I am like innocent or whatever, right? And this is maybe a super particular American reader thing, right? We can't even read books where like, with like bad characters in them without being ashamed that like people will think we are bad because the character in the book is right. Like it's that the obsession with innocence is that deep. But I think, it's also true that like when, if for people who have kids or deal with or care for young people or something, there's times where like I've told my child no to something that was like important that they didn't have or whatever, or like, somebody's trying to run in the street and I'm like, come here, you can't run in the street like that. What do you do? And they're crying and terrified. And I'm like, oh, those are also moments where they experience me as being like terrifying too to them. And so you have to actually think about like other people's kind of conscious experience in as best you can, not just the people who do good things, not just the people who do like fucked up shit or whatever, and be able to kind of dispense with the pretensions that you are like better than the people that you're describing, or that there's a magical person out there who like based on their the performance of their like identity or whatever is like inherently better, and that is a model. I think this kind of shit takes a lot of work, and that I think has, and for me, that is part of maybe the thing that we describe as, I think sometimes we use the word care without describing it, but I think there's a careful way that Brian Washington is using it in this review, and that was something I was thinking about to include my like projecting the kind of care that I thought would help or be useful onto all of these animals in the book. Are all dying, right? They're all dying, right? I'm like, oh, this is so sweet. This is so sweet, right? Like this animal's maybe having a great time, these snakes, iguanas. I'm like, I put them in a fucking cage and like, mated them and like sold their bed. Like, why the fuck would that, so it's like, that kind of thing that we regularly do with like non-human animals, in a way is like somehow we exempt ourselves from that in our interactions with other people sometimes, especially when it's morally easy to be like, I am right, because I can pick out the wrongs in these other spaces and people. So I think that was like I agree with that being very careful, and kind of very thoughtful.
I also went on Goodreads mistake, and it was like, I don't know if I should be reading this book with all this animal abuse. I was like, what is happening? I was like, what?
Yeah, I know.
I just like could not handle that comment. I was like, wow.
Yeah.
But clearly you've thought about this. Like you were, you've been reflective about the ways that.
But sometimes people, and so I should say, like, somebody approached me about this at a reading or whatever. We're like, trying to also correct me on like the different, phylums of animals and like how certain animals were. Right. It was like, you can guess what kind of person it was that did that whole thing. And it's just very funny to kind of observe, right? It's like, it's also true that, and this has to do with the language thing too. It's like when people see you and then they hear you speak in a certain way, whether it's like, like cussing or the language that I use primarily in the book and to describe my own life and the lives of people that I know and love, it's automatically, right, they tend to think like, oh, this person is like an idiot, It's like, and I've gotten used to that enough where it's like mostly kind of funny, but I always forget until like those instances come in as like, did you know that like hamsters and gerbils aren't the same thing, And I'm like, oh, never thought of that. Thanks. So there's that kind of thing that you have to be prepared to deal with that kind of goofiness sometimes, and like meet readers where they are, but still try to be as inclusive and kind of responsible as possible to the things that you maybe care most about, while taking like risks that are like more intensive than maybe like something like that, which is like, I don't worry about that kind of reading as much.
We're almost out of time, but
Okay.
I'll just like mention one thing. So Lonnie will come back on this screen, but one thing I did want to just like kind of do real quick is like the one notion about fantasy is that, my younger brother, he's just a little bit older than you are. And there's a way where he had nothing to say for a while, like he would be in his class. The only thing he could write about is I have nothing to say, until it came to like, he really wanted to fantasize about Street Fighter, like it was always like, striking. It was always like the same, like Balrog. I don't know like the characters, but like, yeah, it was always the same character that he was always like fantasizing about. And so I think in the same way that you're talking about the complications of care, I think like, though we don't have time to talk about it, I do read the use of fantasy, because people are like, it's either escapism or comfort, but it's never just ever that in this book. It's like many things, it shifts and it changes over time, but it's like a force in the book. So I hope you all, enjoy Joseph's book. Please purchase it. And Lonnie will come back on screen.
Yeah, thank you, Kathy. Hey.
Great interview. Thank you so much. I love both the spirit and the energy and the friendship that is obviously clearly on display between the two of you. So thank you both very much for your time tonight. I want to remind folks that we're going to do an after hours. It's going to start at 8:05 Central. You can come hang out, ask your questions of both Joseph and Kathy about their work. Maybe we can ask Kathy, maybe she'll read a piece of her own, maybe in after hours, if she's
Sure.
willing and able. We would certainly love to hear that, and maybe even a little bit more reading from Joseph as well would be lovely. There were a couple questions submitted in advance, so I'm gonna go ahead and ask just a couple of them. So first question was, as people of color, what would be the advice you give to young children interested in creative writing? And is it also, from the same person, is it also important to write political poems that speak truth? If either you could both jump in, or Joseph, maybe go ahead and take the lead.
Yeah, I mean, it's a complicated question. I think, folks of color, particularly Black folks in this country, have dealt with a certain kind of responsibility to write, quote unquote, like politically or in a certain political mode for a long time, kind of like forever, right? And I think sometimes I have problems with the distinction between what is or is not political in this sense, right? And this is like a, kind of 70s feminist mantra that you could think about, right? Of course. So as one thing. And then the other thing is like, I think that this is like a more complicated thing. I think that the realm of like politics proper is now very, very different for different people. And it depends on the place that you're at in your life. I mean, I'll tell one story. I spent most of my life working at a hospital, this emergency department in Einstein as an adult. And like one of the questions that you would ask people to figure out their level of coherence, right? This is like whether a person was in a kind of quote unquote normal mental state, which of course, whatever the fuck that is like, oh, do you know, the day of the week, the month, do you know who the president is, right? It's particularly like the president question. Lots of people would actually not know that question, or even like a lot of, and be completely sober and kind of with it, right? Or just like fucked up. They're like, I was working, for 16 hours and I got hurt at the job and I'm coming to you for like this thing called care. And there are all these assumptions about what counts for what people know and what they should know to be like good kind of liberal democratic subjects, even though it's technically our responsibility. And I mean, ours like intellectuals, educators, et cetera, whatever, to be creating the space for and teaching people things. And it's like us that are failing, but we are always looking, I think sometimes we set expectations for people who have a lot less power than us to like be the ones doing things and kind of like making change. So I would say like for a young person, right? Like young person of color who in a lot of situations has a bunch of other shit to worry about, I wouldn't be like, oh, you have to write things that are, because sometimes what becomes capital P political is part of a political tradition or a set of political expectations that other people have, not what might be the most important thing for that person. And this is especially true with children who are the most mistreated people on the planet. Particularly in this country, you're a kid, you have no rights, right? Most people don't respect you or listen to anything you say. And I think, it's important to think like what is important for you with regards to a political agenda and do that, and not necessarily consider like what, is already existing, a lot of which doesn't work. So I don't know. I'll stop talking.
Oh, amen on that for sure. 100%. I totally hear you on that. We're also right at 8 p.m. Kathy, we're going to hear your answer at after hours because I want to hear your take on that as well. Everyone, thanks for coming. Come hang out with Joseph and Kathy and me. Come ask your own questions. My guess is there's going to be plenty more where all of that came from. So thanks so much, everyone. And we'll see you hopefully at Lisa D'Amour in person next week. Is it next week? Is it next week? It is next week, isn't it? Whenever it is.